example.
And how has theory informed your policy work?
Well, I found that in the book Power and Interdependence that Bob Keohane and I wrote just before I first went into government, we had talked about the areas where realism based on threats of force and security as the dominant issue were dominant or was the most useful theory, and other areas where international relations becoming more complex. We called it complex interdependence, where there are more transnational actors. And it was intriguing that when I was in the State Department to find examples of each. Dealing with the nuclear issues, I found that sometimes when we were trying to persuade France not to sell a reprocessing plant to Pakistan, or to deal with the relationship between Pakistan and India and damp down any potential nuclear arms race between them and so forth, the realist theories were extremely helpful there. Mm-hmm. But there are other instances, for example, when we were trying to change the policy in the Clinton administration in the Carter administration on the use of plutonium and reprocessing, where there were suddenly transnational aspects which were very powerful. The so-called nuclear priesthood or nuclear mafia, the group of people who deeply believed that reprocessing and the use of plutonium was the future of the world, had more in common with each other than they did with their fellow co-nationals. Mm-hmm. So there were transnational alliances made between, let's say, departments of energy and science and technology against state departments and defense departments. So there were odd coalitions that were formed which weren't caught by the simple realist model.
We should explain to the audience that in complex interdependency, the emphasis on different kinds of actors in relations between states, where there may be no fixed priority in military terms, and the use of force may not happen, basically. Right.
Yeah, basically the realist assumption is that security is the dominant concern, mm-hmm. force is the major instrument, mm-hmm. and that governments more or less maintain their coherence as they interact with each other. And in complex interdependence, essentially, security is less dominant as a concern, force is less useful as an instrument. You have many transnational actors that are going to and fro mm-hmm. across borders, making coalitions that aren't always well described by national labels. And so when I went into government, I was quite fascinated to find evidence that these things that I'd written about actually existed and were influencing me and the policies that I was trying to deal with. So one cannot understand the world or deal with the world if one has simply a realist or a liberal view. Mm-hmm. The world is mixed of both.
Can you identify one place where a theory, an idea you brought, mattered in a program that emerged?
Well, I think the design, but even more the implementation of Carter's nonproliferation policy rested very heavily on some of the theories that I'd worked out about transnational alliances, and also about the role of international institutions, of how could we use the International Atomic Energy Agency, and how did we develop a new study group, which we called the International Nuclear Fuel Cycle Evaluation, as a way to buy time to get people to rethink how they approach this problem. Also the establishment of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which controlled the exports. Those things, I think, rested very heavily on the work that I had done on transnational coalitions and on institutions before going into government.
So in today's world, what do you think America's role should be?
Well, I think the Americans, as the largest power, have to remain involved without falling into the trap of becoming the world's policeman and being over-involved. And I think what that means is that there are certain key things that we need to do, because if we don't do them, no one else will, and if nobody does them, it'll be a much more chaotic world. One of them is to maintain the overall balance of power. That means that American military power remains very important to stability in Europe, in Asia, in an area like the Persian Gulf, where we still are dependent on oil supplies. And therefore, the primary or first thing that America has to do is make sure that we have a stable balance. And that's why we have 100,000 troops in Europe, 100,000 in Asia, about 20,000 in the Gulf. Essentially is because it's a stabilizing factor, and we benefit from that stability. The second thing we need to do is to help preserve an open international economy so that you do have benefits that can flow from international economic transactions. There are lots of problems with this. It creates friction at home. It can create a number of difficulties. But I do believe that in the long run, a liberal international economic trading system is better than one which becomes closed and protectionist. And I think that's an important role. And a third thing I think the Americans need to do is act as the organizer of coalitions of the willing of countries that can deal with serious issues, as we did in the Gulf War. And I think we need to, in that same context, provide support for international institutions. People complain about UN peacekeeping, but when you do something through the UN, it means 70% of the costs are being provided by others. It also means there's a legitimization of what we're doing. So we need to be sometimes people have used the organizer of the posse or the supporter of the institutions by which countries can pull together to accomplish certain common purposes. And then finally, I think we need to be the peacemaker and the country that tries to mediate the difficult conflicts, whether it be Northern Ireland or the Middle East or South Asia, because that, again, is a role which, because of our size and power, we're able to do. So those are the international roles. I should add to that a fifth point, which is we need to still continue to act as a beacon at home. Our soft power, our appeal to other countries, depends very much on our maintaining an open, vibrant democracy and a successful economy at home. And that is sometimes people think, oh, well, that's domestic policy. It has nothing to do with foreign policy. I would argue that you can't make that distinction, that the ability of our ability to run a good society at home is central to our position abroad.
What effects on policy do issues like human rights then have? It's as if you're looking at a realist focus on these issues, but lo and behold, complex interdependency comes back to affect what you can do. Comment on that.
Human rights are always going to be an important part of American foreign policy. For one reason, the American people want a moralistic portion of their foreign policy. And for another, standing for human rights is part of that American beacon that I referred to earlier. But it's also true that if you have a human rights policy only, then you don't have a foreign policy. Foreign policy is trading off a series of objectives that the American people have: strategic, economic, social, moral. And if you just have one, then you don't have a foreign policy, you have a human rights policy. It's also not clear, for example, to follow the China case again, that just sanctioning China, cutting off trade and so forth, would really advance human rights. The interesting thing is that human rights probably flourish more when you have rapid economic development than when you have continuing poverty. And it's interesting to look at the case of Taiwan and South Korea, where the repressive regimes that they had could not sustain the same type of repression after per capita incomes passed about $5,000 and a serious middle class began to develop. So the last thing we want to do in pursuit of human rights, if we care about the rights, let's say, of Chinese, is to stop their economic growth.